Hello everyone. As we finish up our first week of read alouds, I just want to say that I'm really proud of everyone who's really persisting through these challenges as we are figuring out how this new style of learning is going to work. Today we are going to get to read about another group of students who had to persist through a challenge to go to school. And while theirs was not similar to ours, and that it was kind of hello everyone. So as we finish up our first week, I want to just first say that I'm really proud of how you all have shown persistence through these challenges in order to keep learning and keep growing. Today we are actually going to get to read about another group of students who had to persist through a challenge in order to go to school. But this was not about an illness. This was about laws that specifically inhibited their ability to continue learning. So we learned about the word segregation yesterday. So think back to your definition for segregation. From the glossary, I found that to segregate means to separate or keep people apart. So our story today revolves around specifically school segregation. So you all made a prediction during our morning meeting about what you thought school segregation might mean. And now we're going to start using this story and the feelings that we are all feeling about not being able to go to school to start to connect to these characters and make some bigger connections to our own lives and really understand what this challenge might have been like. So we are starting at chapter 1 today, entitled First Steps. Already I'm starting to see some of the images that are characteristic of informational text, like these photographs that from the color and from the type of things that I see in the photo, I think are probably from the past, probably around the time of the Civil Rights Movement. So in this first picture, I'm seeing what looks like a police officer holding a sign that says, "Waiting room for white only, by order, police department." And then our subheading over here says, "Before the Civil Rights Movement, African American people were prevented from using many of the facilities used by white people." So from this, I can already start to make a prediction that lots of things that I think everyone can use now, like schools or the police department, probably weren't equal during the time of the Civil Rights Movement in the past. So now we're going to start tracking along at the very top on page 9. And as I said, as we start to read, we're going to start to mark some of the key events that I'm starting to identify in my reading, so I can start to piece together the different events that led to more freedoms and justice for everyone in society. So we're starting at the very top, page 9. In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the Case of Plessy versus Ferguson that segregation was legal. Businesses and governments could set up separate facilities for African Americans on the condition that they were of equal quality to the facilities for white people. The separate but equal rule could be applied anywhere. Schools, restaurants, department stores, train stations and train cars, buses, and even drinking fountains were designated either for whites or for colored, a term commonly used for African Americans at the time. In reality, the facilities were rarely of equal quality. So the first big event that I see is happening in 1896, when the U.S. Supreme Court, that's the highest court in the land, they rule over court cases which say whether or not things are actually constitutional, whether they're legal for the United States as a whole nation. So their decisions apply to all the states, Texas and North Carolina and Alaska, their word goes. And they said in 1896 that segregation was legal. So I'm going to start to chart that now on my key events tracker. Okay, I am now inside my Google folder, inside Google Classroom, to find the key events in the Civil Rights Movement slide. So I'm just filling in this graphic organizer. Now, I'm going to start with the big event that I came across first on page 9, the 1896 Case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, when I think about who was involved, I know that the Supreme Court made the big decision, but that lots of different facilities were affected, like businesses, trains, department stores, drinking fountains, and all other types of public facilities that now lots of different people can use. But it was important because this is arguably the most important piece for us to start to think about. It was important because this legalized, that made it legal, segregation, and said that separate but equal was okay. So now we're going to pick right back up on page 10. I'm looking right here at the subheading that says the issue of education. In many places across the country, white and African American students attended separate schools. The schools were supposed to be equal, but usually they were not. Education in African American schools was often extremely poor. With little money from the government, these schools could not afford books or enough good teachers. The school buildings were often in disrepair because the local governments did not provide enough money for their proper maintenance. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, fought court battles to improve the state of education. The NAACP is an organization that was created to support civil rights. In 1954, the NAACP won a major battle. In Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, the Supreme Court ruled against segregation in education, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP argued the case. He would later become a U.S. Supreme Court justice. The Supreme Court concluded that, quote, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place in education. With segregation in schools now officially illegal, schools had to integrate students. Although the Supreme Court demanded integration, the judges did not say when integration had to take place. They merely recommended that it take place with all deliberate speed. No one knew exactly what that meant, but the ruling would soon be tested. The Little Rock Nine. Some schools quietly integrated, but others refused. States in the South said it could take several years before the time was right. School boards said the public might react violently to a sudden change. Daisy Lee Gadsden Bates, the president of the NAACP in Arkansas, took on the challenge. After 3 years of pushing Arkansas schools to integrate, Bates convinced Central High School in Little Rock to open its doors to black students. Bates handpicked 9 African American students to be the first to attend the school. They were smart, responsible, and tough enough to stand up to the pressure of what lay ahead. The group, which became known as the Little Rock Nine, entered Central High in 1957. They were the first students to integrate a school in the South. On the first day of classes, September 4th, the Arkansas National Guard surrounded the school on the orders of Arkansas Governor Orville Falbus. The 9 had arranged to meet and walk in together, but one of the students did not receive the message. As a result, she found herself in the middle of an angry white mob and was kept out of school by the armed guardsmen. She was rushed to safety. 19 days later, the students tried again to enter, this time together. The mob and the guard again surrounded the school. The 9 were again rushed out. President Eisenhower steps in. By this time, President Dwight D. Eisenhower had seen enough. For the first time since the Civil War, a president put the country's military to work against its own people. Taking control of the National Guard away from Governor Falbus, Eisenhower had members of the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division join their ranks. Under orders from the president, the National Guard and the Army troops held back the crowds. The Army remained at the school to protect the Little Rock 9 until November. For the rest of the year, the students faced constant threats. The school kept all 9 of them separated in different classes all day. At the end of the school year, the state closed all Little Rock public schools. The schools remained closed for an entire year. In 1959, this last attempt by the Arkansas government to halt integration was overcome. The Supreme Court declared that closing the schools was against the law. In the fall, the schools opened again, this time to whites and African Americans alike. So early on in our reading, I pointed out the 1896 Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a key event leading up to the Civil Rights Movement because it told states that they had the power to decide what equal looked like. For many states, that meant that schools, restaurants, lots of things that everyone uses today could be different for different groups of people. So, as you go back into our reading, I want you to identify some other key events that you think were important to the Civil Rights Movement and how we began to see changes for freedom and justice in America.